Great.
Okay.
Thanks. Yay, she's back. Hello, Dr. Rahman. First of all, am I pronouncing your last name correctly?
Yes.
Thank
Absolutely.
you. Good. Well, welcome, Dr. Sameena Rahman, to the Peri community. We are thrilled to have you here. I've been wanting to have a conversation specific to this topic for a very long time. It's often, mentioned and threaded into many of the conversations I've had, but to dedicate this time specifically to this, I'm just really grateful for. And before I sort of formally introduce you, I want to also say that your Instagram feed, where I see you, is phenomenal.
It's I do it all myself. That's why I don't.
It's not even that. It's perfect. It's absolutely you. But the information that you are clearly committed to bringing forward is critical, appreciated, informative, helpful, enlightening. So for all of those reasons, I'm really happy to speak directly to you. So I just want to ask everyone, if you wouldn't mind just muting your device. I'm going to actually type that in real quick too, and hopefully people see it.
Thank you. I'm so happy to be here. I love what you guys are doing. I was reviewing your site a couple of days ago, and I was like, wow, you're just putting out some good stuff, awareness. I love it, because I can tell you how many patients I see on a daily basis that, a lot, actually, I would have to say midlife women come in really well informed, I think but have been so dismissed, and it's been, I just can't wait to get into this conversation.
Oh, good. Okay, so also just for your information, I just ask everyone and anyone who has a question or a comment to put it in the chat. I will facilitate that for you unless you just naturally get to yourself, which is absolutely fine. Dr. Sameena Rahman is a board-certified OB-GYN with a practice tailored to meet the needs of women for gynecologic and cosmetic services. Dr. Rahman started her own practice to focus on her special areas of interest to ensure patients have their best quality of life. Dr. Rahman is one of the few physicians nationally to receive the designation of, is it ISWISH? Are you allowed to say it that way?
Exactly, yeah.
Great. That is the International Society for the Study of Women's Sexual Health, and is actively involved with cutting-edge approaches to sexual pain and sexual dysfunction. She's also an active member of the IPPS, the International Pelvic Pain Society, and specializes in a multidisciplinary approach to chronic pelvic pain. For midlife women, Dr. Rahman is also a specialist in menopause management with the designation of certified menopause physician through the North American Menopause Society. As I mentioned already, Dr. Rahman, you have just a fantastic feed of information and a clear commitment and desire to speak to, about, for all women, but certainly highlighting what we call marginalized women, which I have a little trouble with to begin with, but I think it's important to just state. And I'm curious, was it sort of a professional experience, a personal experience that kind of pivoted your focus and kind of encouraged you to be speaking more pointedly about women of color?
Absolutely, probably both. I think that obviously, I'm a South Asian American Muslim. I grew up in the South in the 80s and 90s. So I love the South. I have nothing against the South, but definitely, and I would move again in a heartbeat, but I feel that I did experience my share of, sort of issues around racism, but actually as a physician in training, as a medical student, I often would see how other healthcare professionals whether it's a doctor, a nurse, you know, a social worker, whatever, who would, you know, maybe slide, you know, give a side eye to a patient that was of color or didn't take their pain seriously. I always tell a story about when I was a resident, I was an intern, and the first time I went to go see, we were going to see an Indian patient who was in labor, who just didn't tolerate vaginal exams very well because she had, you know, a sexual dysfunction and vaginismus. And my attending, I mean, remember, I'm a first couple of weeks into my internship, you know, very, you know, anxious. I have a couple of attendings around me who are seasoned. Both of them happen to be, you know, Caucasian. And they looked at me and were like, what's the deal with your people? I mean, I don't get it. They act like nothing. They've never had anything in their vagina. I mean, I just still literally remember these words, and my mouth dropped and I had nothing to say because I was an intern. But the other attendings that were there also didn't say anything. And I was like, oh my God, if I feel so slighted by this and so like alarmed, what must these poor patients feel who are not getting the appropriate care because of this, you know, of basically implicit bias, you know?
Sure,
I mean,
sure.
we know it exists. We know it exists in every arena of life, and medicine is not, you know, one of these that is an exception to the rule. So
Right.
I think it was both personal and professional that I was like, no, someone has to, like, you know, empower the patient too. So,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And so systemic racism, cultural bias in medicine, if we could just hover there for a few minutes, because I know that there's what we all experience walking into a doctor's office can sometimes feel like anecdotal information. And then we hear terms like cultural bias in medicine. You just laid out a horrifying example of just that. But I'm curious also about what physicians are learning or not learning. Yeah, if you could get into that bit.
Yeah, I mean, I do think there's a big cultural shift. You know, I teach at Northwestern at Feinberg School of Medicine. With medical students and residents, and I think that there is definitely this awareness of implicit bias at the level of the academic centers, and there's definitely more diversity and inclusion committees that have formed. But you know, I think compared to when I was a resident and a student, people are learning more how to address, you know, different cultures, how to listen to patients. I think it's you know, clear from all the data that, you know, women are discounted for, you know, pain and other things. Women of color are discounted even more, you know. And so I think that, you know, the literature is there, the data is there, and people are now addressing it. So there's definitely like classes, you know, cultural sensitivity, you know, we used to have cultural sensitivity stuff too, but I think that they're a little more aggressive in treatment. I'm part of the International Society for the Study of Women's Sexual Health. I've given talks on implicit bias to other, you know, nurse practitioners, doctors, social workers, you know, and so I think the institutions and the communities are very much interested. And it's just a matter of implementing it in action, you know, like what you learn and how you're going to address it, because we all have biases. I mean, you know, I can even think of all the times that oh God, I was probably biasing, you know, and so I like to learn from my own mistakes too, because no one is, you know, devoid of implicit bias, but I think that people are getting more aware of it now.
If you would, you just made me think of this. Tell me a little bit about what you teach when you're going in and giving talks to a group of your peers. What are you talking about on this subject?
I mean, my first thing is always to actually listen to the patient. I mean, you're going to walk in and you're going to see someone and your mind's already going to go toward, okay, I'm going to walk in, I'm going to see a woman with her hair covered. Oh, she's Muslim. Oh, she must be submissive. She must be this, she must be that. So, you know, take those biases and just put them on the side table for a minute and actually listen to what your patient is telling you and listen to what your patient is asking. You know, don't already assume that she's here because, you know, she doesn't want to know how to talk about sex, or she doesn't, you know, feel comfortable with menstruation or whatever. Like, you know, everyone's experiences are different. You know, we have, you know, culture, we have acculturation into different, you know, societies, and we have all these experiences that make up a person. And so, yeah, you can look at someone and automatically assume things about them, but my first thing is always take a step back and just listen, really listen to what your patient's telling you. Don't try to tell her what her problem is. You need to actually let her tell you, and you listen to them. And then you can kind of start your advice, guidance, exam, all that stuff. But I think that's one thing. And that's one thing that patients always tell me. For so long, I didn't feel like I was heard. For so long, I told someone that I was having, memory loss. I thought I was going crazy. It was brain fog the whole time. I wish I hadn't met you when I was going through perimenopause and not menopause. For years, I thought I was going nuts. But thank you for listening. And that's one thing I always say, like, you got to actually listen to what they're saying, and not already assume from the get-go that you know what's going on.
Dr. Rahman, just to piggyback off of that, before we get more into the patient, if you will, are you hearing from people, from your peers, your colleagues, that this kind of the talks you're giving or anyone else is giving, I get, what am I trying to say? I guess I feel like there's a gap. There's always going to be a bit of a gap between the patient and their physician. But what else? First of all, are the talks helping? Are they helping doctors to sort of tap the brakes before they walk into a room where there is a patient who doesn't look anything like them, isn't maybe speaking a language that they speak, et cetera, and be sensitive, aware, attentive to all their needs? Or is there something else that needs to happen, prior to that would be even more helpful to physicians?
I think that definitely, I definitely get positive feedback. I actually even have, doctors email me, or other nurse practitioners, or whoever they are. They email me like, I just had this patient. I don't want to make a mistake. Can you tell me, like, is this the right way to say this? Or, how should I address this? I think that, the language is key, and so I think there is a very positive effect happening, with some of the talks that I give. Of course, people are going to be like, side eye, roll their eyes at me about, whatever. Oh, that's just, you're just being hypersensitive, or, whatever the case may be. I'm sure there are clinicians that say that as well. I don't necessarily always hear from them, but it is definitely something I imagine happening because there's.
I have no doubt.
Yeah.
I mean, people are walking in with their own biases, their own racism, their own bigotry. So it's hard to imagine every time as a physician that those things are put down when they walk in and see a patient. Absolutely. But that's exactly what I'm thinking about is sort of how to reach people who want to be reached, who are in the business of caring for women. Okay. What do you assess? What do you see? What, I guess, in your educated opinion, is the reason behind the racial, ethnic differences that women are having in perimenopause? I know this is a huge question, but this is starting to get the meat of what we're talking about.
Yeah, I mean, I think that there's a lot of data on sort of like the allostatic load, or the weathering that happens to.
Can you talk about that? Yes, I was going to ask.
Yeah, so I mean, you talk about systemic, let's take like the African-American community, for instance, like systemic racism has, caused them to hit roadblocks on every aspect of their life, housing, whatever, food, whatever the case may be, education, everything. And there's a lot of theories on the microcellular level that this load has, caused all these physiologic changes to happen, right? It almost changes your epigenetics. I mean, there's a similar theory about how, as a side note, like how South Asians, for instance, carry 25% of the world population, but carry 67% of the world heart disease. And what's that about? Well, there's some theories about how, hundreds of years of colonization under the British and being forced to endure periods of starvation and famine change their epigenetics. And that's why they're more susceptible to metabolic syndrome. I think the same can be said for, Latinx, African-American communities, and all the other women of color out there, that there's a load that you carry when you have generationally tens and hundreds of years been carrying all this stress. It's changed your actual DNA. It's changed your epigenetics. There's no wonder that We see so much more PCOS, heart disease, Black women have more stroke, all this stuff. Like, it's not just, and it's just not because of like obesity and lifestyle factors. I mean, some of these patients are lean and thin and, have all these other things, but they still carry that allostatic load, the weathering effect that has happened. And so that is why, it is, the data we have does suggest that Black women and Latinx and South Asian patients can go through perimenopause earlier, can go through menopause earlier, and also experience like longer periods of time of the worst symptoms, those vasomotor symptoms that make it hard for you to sleep, the hot flashes, the night sweats, makes it harder for you to sleep at night, makes it harder for you to live and work at work. And what happens that now we know that patients that experience vasomotor symptoms longer end up also having more heart disease. So it's all connected, So I think that allostatic load, the weathering effect, the stress, the life stressors have placed such a burden on women of color that, it's changed our genetics. And, despite sometimes even despite lifestyle changes, we still know that cardiac disease is the #1 killer in females, right? In women. And so, that's something to make a big point about because,
Sorry, Dr. Rahman. I just want to pause you for 1 second, just for anyone who's not familiar with the term allostatic load or weathering, if you could just give us a definition of what we're talking about when we're talking about that.
It's just, like what we think of as cumulative stressors that might activate different parts of your metabolic system, whether or not it's your cortisol levels, your norepinephrine, your epinephrine, which then places a stress sort of on a cellular level, and then can change actually, your metabolic function and how you kind of, it's like it's literally down to a cellular level.
Right. So in the case of Black women, for example, when we're talking about that and we're talking about having a worse perimenopausal, menopausal experience, it's the idea or the reality that a generational thread of systemic racism, oppression, marginalization, lack of access has affected and altered our DNA such that we're teed up to have a more dramatic perimenopausal experience despite healthcare access, despite socioeconomic status, education, all the things. Yes, all the things that we sort of say, those should have you covered.
If she's smoking or whatever. No, if you correct for all those factors, even like leaner patients with less, that don't smoke, that have all these other, like, they still have higher risks or higher rates of it. So.
Okay. Dr. Rahman, a question came in that I want to read off to you before we go on. Are epigenetics recognized within the broader medical community? Are efforts being made to spread more awareness of this very real thing that affects us?
I mean, I think, I have a skewed perspective because I surround myself with, other, perimenopause, menopause doctors. I surround, a lot of my colleagues and close colleagues are, in ISHWISH and they know all this stuff. They go to the lectures, they hear everything. I think on a broader sense, it's probably not, but I do think there are aspects of social media that has even made, because I'll have some, I just saw this doctor on social media who was talking about epigenetics. I know what you're talking about. So like, even if it's not, because, the big problem is, once you're out of medical school and residency, where you get your additional education, medicine changes all the time. Things that we believed 20 years ago that, women should be off of hormone therapy is not the case anymore. And unless you make an active effort to continue your medical education, you're not going to get this knowledge. And so I think that the healthcare workers that are out there, at conferences, on social media, like doing the things to, improve themselves as a clinician, those are the other clinicians that I find that are really aware of it. Unfortunately, I do think that there are those clinicians that, they don't keep up to date. And so those are the ones that I see. My patients tell me I've been through this for 7 or 8 other doctors, and you're the first one to tell me this. And it's like those, clinicians that are not keeping up with, whether or not it's on social media or in conferences or whatever, they're the ones that need it the most, unfortunately, and they're not getting it. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you for that. Okay. So I want to delicately parse out women. If you could just sort of tap back into and please know these are broad strokes that we're talking about. Everybody is different. Everybody is having a different experience, but for the purposes of this conversation, if you could just sort of tap back into the Black woman's perimenopausal experience, the Latinas woman's perimenopausal experience, Southeast Asian, Indigenous women who I rarely hear anything about in this conversation at all. Could you just sort of take us through go ahead, what's happening with everyone?
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, a lot of our data is from this huge study that from the 90s, the study of women across the nation, the SWAN study, which, they're still kind of, extrapolating data from, but it was sort of looking at these experiences of different patients from different cultures and different ethnic backgrounds. And so, average age of menopause in North America is 52, right? 52.4. That's what the North American Menopause Society has recently quoted. And so I think the percentage is something like for Black women, they have a 30% higher chance of going into early menopause. And specifically when they talked about early menopause, it was like, age 40 or less. And that we actually consider that like almost primary ovarian insufficiency. But that, and what does that mean when you go into earlier menopause? And that means that you might have more heart disease at the end of the day because you don't have that cardioprotective effect. If you're not getting your estrogen replacement, you might have a longer period of time without estrogen. Your bones might become more brittle and you might fall more, and that could create a risk of dying. You might, like I said, I think Black women also have a 40% higher chance of having significant heart disease, and stroke is still the #1 killer in that population. So it's like, you're going through menopause earlier, potentially. You're going through early menopause earlier. You're going to have longer periods of vasomotor symptoms that we know actually increase your risk of heart disease, which is still, again, the #1 killer of women. So what does that mean? Our longevity is changing, right? It means that our quality of life is crap because a lot of these patients have a distrust in the medical community. And, even the really, the ones that come to me that are really like, very much have done their research, have done their data, even that at times they're like, I don't know, I'm not sure if I trust this, and it's because of generational distrust of how they've been treated by the medical community. So, we're talking about really changes in their quality of life and their longevity. The same is true for Latinx patients. I think if the average non-Hispanic white female goes through has perimenopausal symptoms of specifically those vasomotor symptoms like the hot flashes and night sweats for like 6.5 years, I think it's like 10 years for Black women and 9 years for Latinx. And so again, we know that if you're untreated, vasomotor symptoms increase your risk of heart disease. So this is what's happening. We see it more in these populations. We see, I think some of the study also demonstrated that, Latinx patients will have higher rates of vaginal symptoms like the genital urinary syndrome and menopause, where because there's lack of estrogen in the vagina, you're not having as much elasticity, you're not having as much, the pH has changed, so you don't have as much lubricant. That leads to painful sex, which may not be addressed. They might think this is just something I have to suck up. And then, frequent urinary symptoms, we know the urgency and frequent UTIs for an untreated vagina without, topical estrogen can lead to more frequent UTIs. What happens to an 80-year-old patient who's in, either nursing home or caretaker and they get a UTI? They get sort of extreme delirium and they die from UTIs, urosepsis. So like vaginal estrogen actually can save your life in that capacity. And we know that for patients that, have a history of, other diseases that make estrogen not indicated for them can still take vaginal estrogen because it doesn't increase your systemic levels to the point where it would impact those other organs. So I think that that is, you know, something that we should, you know, keep in mind. I always encourage vaginal estrogen for all my patients that are willing to or able to take it. You know, for South Asians, again, the same, it can be said that there is earlier menopause thought. What's interesting in the South Asian culture is that, you know, menstruation, and it depends on the religion and everything. And I don't mean to make generalizations. I speak as a South Asian who has had taboos around menstruation her whole life. But, you know, there was a recent review article that was presented at the North American Menopause Society in the fall and published in the Menopause Journal that looked at the South Asian experience in perimenopause and menopause. Whereas, you know, like for religiously, a lot of people didn't feel like they could pray or go to the temple or go to the mosque or whatever when they're menstruating, or, you know, they felt like it was that they're unclean. And that goes from the stigmatization of menstruation from early on. You know, what's interesting in this culture or our culture is that a lot of women embraced menopause. Like, oh, now I can pray whenever I want, or I can go to the temple whenever I want.
Interesting.
And it actually made for, in some of the studies, a better menopausal transition for them. I mean, they may not have gone and got their estrogen or whatever, but hey, you know what? I actually don't have to worry about feeling unclean anymore like I've felt all my life, or I don't have to worry about, you know, not having sex during my period like I used to in the past. Or I can go to the mosque without thinking about it anymore, you know?
Wow.
And so it almost made for like an embracing of the situation. And whenever you embrace a situation with positivity, you're more likely to have a better, you know, experience for yourself and a better quality of life. So that was, I found very interesting as well. And I think the same can be said for some of the East Asian cultures too, because it's kind of ingrained in the culture many times about how, you know, menstruation is like dirtier and all that stuff. So that's interesting. One other factor about when Black women go through menopause, they often have longer periods of time of irregular menstruation and maybe even heavier menstruation. We know that this population has more fibroids and other gynecologic conditions that can cause painful periods and very, very excessive bleeding. So, you know, those gynecologic conditions on top of this, you know, such as, you know, the fibroids or, you know, endometriosis, whatever, can make for a worse menopausal transition. So you have to address those separately as well. So, but they do tend to have more bleeding issues in that perimenopausal transition. So I think that.
I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, so I think that has to be addressed on an additional level in that population.
The issue around things like fibroids, endometriosis, PCOS, these conditions are more predominant for Black women, and
necessarily, we don't know enough about endometriosis, but for sure fibroids. You know, South Asians have more PCOS too. Like, I think that's the whole, you know, and also LatinX patients as well. So,
and those conditions will again sort of prime you for potentially more difficult perimenopausal experience.
And especially, you know, something like PCOS where you might have erratic bleeding or you don't bleed for months at a time. When you have like this, you know, hormonal dysregulation happening on top of the normal hormonal dysregulation of perimenopause, the PCOS can actually make it confusing. Like, is this my PCOS? Is this my, you know, although the treatment can be, you know, very similar, like, you know, hormonal therapy or birth control or something like that, depending on the patient. But, you know, you might see a little more of the acne or facial hair or something because you were on birth control through your 30s and now you're 40 something years old. You feel like, my chances of pregnancy are low. I'm just going to wing it. All of a sudden the acne comes back, the irregular cycles, all that stuff. So I think that, you know, those issues I address on a separate level. And then, you know, the weight gain associated with insulin resistance and PCOS, you know, is more dramatic for those patients.
Wow. Okay. This hour is flying and I have so much more I want to get to. I know I want to pivot eventually and give you time to talk about, you know, what you advocate for and what we all can be doing. But before we get exactly there, I want to talk about cultural conversations that you are aware of, that you hear about in all of these communities and how they either help or hinder the experience that women are having. You mentioned, for example, in Southeast Asian community this access now to the free access, if you will,
right.
to the temple, to prayer, to sort of feeling like I don't have to deal with these quote unquote unclean menstrual issues. I've heard that in various populations as well. But I'm just curious, what are some of the things that you have experienced as a physician that women are walking in the door sort of culturally embedded with that impact them?
Yeah. So one of the questions I always ask patients when we were talking, if I get a 40-year-old in my office, I start talking about like, this is what may be coming. Because I feel like just like you get a puberty talk when you're 10 years old, you should get like a potential menopause talk when you're like late 30s, early 40s.
I think we should get it. Yes. I think we should start talking about it during our, when we are in our 30s, when we're in our 20s, even. Yes, I feel like absolutely. It should be on the radar. This is just a part of your journey. Exactly. Don't be surprised, these kinds of things.
Right, exactly. And so, when I have the opportunity, I definitely, will hone in on this. And one of the questions I always ask is, what kind of relationship do you have with your mom? Or if they're still alive, and can you tell me, like, did she ever talk to you about her transition into when she no longer, produced eggs and was menstruating? And, a lot of times it's like, oh, my mom had a hysterectomy, especially among my women of color, like, oh yeah, no, she had a hysterectomy. And like, back then they took out everyone's uteruses. That might be true. Like, unfortunately, a lot of women didn't get the other options. Or it's like, oh no, we didn't talk about that stuff. Mm-hmm. But then I'm always like, well, do you ever remember when you were in college or high school, like, did your mom, do you ever remember her being more irritable at something? Because I remember, my mom never talked about it with me, but I have a distinct memory of her losing her mind. Yeah. on multiple levels, right. Where she would be like a little more erratic. And I, so I can distinctly remember that as an 18, 19-year-old. I think my mom must have went through menopause at 50. Yeah. So that's one, like,
scary days.
Yeah, that's how we can deduce sometimes. And like, okay, so that's probably, when you will, unless you have other conditions affecting. And so, then we talk about that but the conversation becomes very lively sometimes because we'll discuss like, what about your sisters? Do you have older sisters? What's it like over there? And so, a lot of the patients I would say most patients tell me that, unless they came from a very open, family, I think the stigma is so deep about women's health in all cultures, like across the board. I mean, it's really, I think it's a little bit more significant in women of color, but I definitely, I have definitely my Caucasian patients are like, yeah, they didn't talk about it. We don't talk about that stuff either. And so I think it's just such a huge stigma on women's health in general. Like when you talk about menstruation, when you talk about sex, when you talk about menopause, that the taboo is still, so embedded in our society. So this is why I really feel like, with all the stuff that's happening with Oprah talking about menopause, like, we really are having a moment about some of these issues. And I think there's a lot of more information happening with period poverty and period destigmatizing period and all that stuff. So I feel like, in that way, social media is great and bad in some ways, but I think that has been very, very beneficial for a lot of patients. But I do think the stigma is still so, and the taboos around sex and talking about painful sex. I treat a lot of painful sex in my office. And then that is one big thing is that, I just thought it was something I had to deal with, or, until they get to a point where they can't even have sex because it's so uncomfortable, and it becomes one of these like, longer things to treat. So,
and is that issue, I see that's so much of your work. Is that also a place where you see cultural differences, any more cultural biases, are there women who are struggling more or less, or in a certain way or other way, given their race, ethnicity, so on?
Absolutely. I do feel like, all women struggle with talking about like their sexual pain. That's one thing I would say across the board, across ethnicities, across race, across socioeconomic status. When I look at some of the differences of what I've seen, you know, in my years of training and experience, of course, you know, I think the taboo is heavier in some cultures, South Asian cultures, you know, keep your legs crossed, you're not having sex before marriage, all that stuff, and religiously based stuff too. So that stigma is a little bit harder to break in those communities. And so when they do come forward, you know, sometimes they're like, oh, I'm so glad to have met you because I couldn't talk about this in front of my white doctor, you know, whatever the case may be, or not even that, or the male physician that I was dealing with, I didn't feel comfortable with. Although there's, you know, plenty of great, you know, clinicians out there from all cultures and all genders. So I don't want to make that my bias either. But I'm just telling you what patients have told me. So I think that has been really embedded. You know, and sometimes it's like one of these things where I have a couple come in with an unconsummated marriage. You know, they're either South Asian, Muslim, whatever the case may be. And it's like the religion had been so embedded that they couldn't even talk about, you know, some of the stigmas around inside of the religion have been so bad that they couldn't even talk about, you know, the fact that they can't consummate their marriage for 5 or 6 years. And now we're dealing with this, we're dealing with the male having erectile dysfunction, all this stuff. I do think that, you know, I have some of my Black patients who, you know, they don't talk about it much because they don't want, you know, that stigma around, you know, their sexual function either. They've been stigmatized, you know, to be, you know, hypersexual since, you know, slavery days. And so I think that, you know, looking at that, sometimes they're like, oh, you know, I don't know, I don't like to bring it up because I don't want you to think this way about, or if they're, you know, they come from a strong Christian, Muslim, or religious background, you know, it's the other way as well that they don't want to talk about it. So I think that religion and culture has, you know, I see a lot of immigrant patients. So I think that is really embedded in how they sort of even deal with the discussions around sex.
This is such a weird thing. I'm sorry. I just have to say this. I sound so silly saying it because it's so obvious and we've said it a million times, but the menopausal, perimenopausal experience is so much more than the physical stuff, right? Yes. This is just listening to you. I'm just thinking, my God, the things that we are walking into an office wanting help about is so dictated by, or it is dictated by so much more than how we're physically feeling. And I just think I'm so glad we're having this conversation. I'm sorry I interrupted you.
I think, you know, and the symptoms are so vast, right? Because I'm always like, you know, think about where we have estrogen receptors. That's where you might be affected. And we have estrogen receptors all over our body, our skin, our brain, our gums, you know, vagina, your urethra, all this stuff. And I feel like, you know, talking to patients about this, I always have them come back and I'm like, just repeat to me what I told you about this, because it's so much information that we talk about. And I'm just like, they feel they actually always feel overwhelmed too. We're like, well, I can take this, I can take that. I'm like, we're going to take your biggest symptom that you're having right now. We're going to address that today. What makes you the most uncomfortable? What makes you the most sort of like upset during this transitional period? Some people will say it's their sleep cycle. Some people will say it's the hot flashes and night sweats and I can't work. Some people say it's the brain fog, right? I'm in an executive meeting and I'm telling someone something and all of a sudden I'm on a slide and I can't remember what I'm going to say. Right. And I look like an asshole, you know,
I know. Yeah, that's a big one.
It's a big one, actually. And you just never realize how much brain fog or, you know, it's like, oh, I'm so irritable. I'm anxious all the time. Like, you know, and the thing is, like, you're a patient in midlife is balancing. Maybe they're at the pinnacle of their career. Maybe they're taking care of their sick parents. Maybe they have kids that need them. Maybe they have, you know, a really needy spouse, you know, male or female, you know, maybe they've struggled with infertility and they're just dealing with the fact that, you know, they've come to accept it. You know, they're entering the stage where they can't get, you know, pregnant. And there's just so much that you're balancing in the midlife, right? And as women, we put all the burden on our shoulders. And I'm always like, no wonder you're anxious. You can't sleep. Right. Your brain's going like this. I mean, I find the same thing, you know, like I'm in my mid 40s and sometimes I'm like, oh, wait, I wake up in the middle of the night to pee because of urgency. And that's what I'm like, when my patients talk to me, I'm like, I feel you. I honestly feel you. And I've put myself on birth control pills and vaginal estrogen, you know, the works. And so I'm here to put you on that too, if that's what you want, you know. But I do have this honest discussion with them because because of all the, misinformation out there, some of them, just, hesitant to start this. I would say most patients that come to me though, are just like, they're ready to get help no matter what, whatever it is,
So thank you for that segue. This is a perfect place now to kind of look at solutions. However, I'm also thinking about solutions across cultures, ethnicities. Do you feel that menopause management should differ across cultures and communities?
I do, because you have to take into consideration all the patients' fears and anxieties around, taking, medicines or natural or herbal versus, whatever. I will say, I think vaginal estrogen is almost for everyone. So like, that's something across the board, even if you're not having symptoms yet, you might get them like 5 to 7 years later, like a little bit of dryness. Oh, I'm not even having sex. Well, your urinary urgency seems to be an issue for you, so like, because I've seen it firsthand in my own, extended family where, one of, aunts or whatever have gone off of vaginal estrogen and they ended up in urosepsis in the ICU, because they all of a sudden developed a UTI, which is very frequent, in postmenopause, if you're not on vaginal estrogen particularly, but either way. And that slippery slope when you're 80 something years old from urinary tract infection to urosepsis to being, septic where you're like actually in the ICU, like then you have multi-organ failure. And it's like this whole cascade
it's very, I've heard you say sort of throughout our conversation, sort of point out the importance of certain kinds of, I guess, treatments, if you will, or at least attention to what's going on, because it ensures a better outcome or the staving off of various things later, right? So there's definitely this thread about how we address our symptoms now in order to sort of protect ourselves, protect our heart, protect our bones, protect this issue of, I forget the term,
vaginal urinary syndrome of menopause.
Yes. So I want you to get into all that, but I'm also thinking, I feel like after listening to you for 41 minutes, I feel like we need access to more physicians like you, whether they look like us, are familiar with our communities, our ethnicity, our background, whatever it is that allows us to feel more comfortable, seen, heard, respected in a room. Right. That seems like critical.
Absolutely. And I have patients that, like, for instance, I don't practice obstetrics anymore, but every once in a while I'll have a patient that couldn't have sex or, had difficulty and now is pregnant. And they're like, whenever for instance, and this is just an example, where I have a patient who, like, she's African-American, all of a sudden she's freaking out because she's pregnant and now she has to go to someone that she feels like may not listen. Dr. Rahman, what should I do? I'm so comfortable with you. I know you listen to me. How can I, see someone where I know my mortality rate is going to be 3 times higher because I'm, a Black woman. And I'm like, listen, number one, you have to, have this knowledge. You have this knowledge under your belt, right? Like you know the facts, what's true and what's misinformation. Like that's the first goal that you have. You have to know what that is, right? The second thing is you have to advocate for yourself. I mean, and sometimes, that doesn't even work. I mean, self-advocacy, you have to have almost like a team of advocates. So sometimes I'm telling patients to come in with someone else because I'm going to tell you a lot of information. And guess what? You're going to leave here feeling very overwhelmed. But then that's why I'm going to see you back in 2 weeks, because we're going to review what we learned and whether or not you tried the one thing that we decided to treat today, and then we're going to continue this journey until we can get you feeling, where you need to feel and have, good quality of life. But I think that is a big issue that I see is like, self-advocacy, education, and awareness. And so once a patient has sort of these things under their belt, then it's finding the right clinician to work with. And one of the ways, like we have some great organizations. We have the North American Menopause Society, which you can look up, and I would look up a certified menopause provider. These are, doctors, nurse practitioners, whoever that have taken extra time to study and learn about menopause, and they take a test you have to pass the test, and, it's not like, whatever, you have to actually know what all the newest updates are, or you're not going to pass the test. And so there's multiple facets involved in that, but I think that is number one, like going through the right organizations that are very patient focused and patient advocates. And actually it's menopause.org. They have a lot of great patient information out there too. So like even if the questions about frequently asked questions about menopause or whatever, and these are all written by clinicians who are up to date on all the latest literature. The same with like the International Society for the Study of Women's Sexual Health, ISWISH. There are a lot of those clinicians overlap. So you can find one in your area, hopefully. Okay. Obviously there's other resources out there. There's digital resources out there. Some of us, like for instance, I'm trying to get licensed in multiple states so I can at least provide televisits for patients. Because what I'm seeing is that, there's a need, and I think that, having that time, because time is a big factor when it comes to these discussions. Sure. I can't do this in a 10-minute, routine follow-up visit, which is why I don't do these. I always have 1 hour with my patient. We sit and we talk about it. We examine them, all of this stuff. And so going to a busier practice that might be a little more OB focused, although sometimes you'll have, one or two of the docs that are in that practice that are focused on menopause. And again, going to that menopause.org will help you find that. But if it's like all obstetrics all the time, then you're going to have a hard time getting that time.
That's a really good point and suggestion. Okay. So self-advocacy, education, awareness. We have a couple questions that came in that I want to get to. And then one last thing before I let you go. The first is, I'm a breast cancer survivor caused by hormones, so I'm not able to have hormone therapy. I've also had a hysterectomy as part of treatment, so I'm instantly in menopause. What therapy options are there for those of us that cannot have hormone therapy?
Okay. And I would definitely have this discussion, with your oncologist and someone that is, because there are some, oncologists that are okay with a little bit of topical estrogen. It's not going to increase your systemic level. Again, I can't speak to her condition specifically, sure. But there are other options there. Pelvic floor physical therapy is really important because over time, we hold a lot of tension and anxiety in our muscles, and it can get very hypertonic, and that can lead to difficulty with intercourse. Hyaluronic acid based vaginal moisturizer is going to be really good and critical, that you can use it a couple times a week to help to lubricate and moisturize the vagina. Of course, using lubricants before intercourse. There is also a CO2 laser called the Mona Lisa Touch that I've used on a lot of breast cancer survivors who are hesitant. Either their oncologist is hesitant, or they just don't want to consider the thought of any kind of hormone, even if it doesn't raise their systemic levels, scares them enough that, we use that, and the data on it is great. And it's a CO2 carbon dioxide laser that works to increase your glycogen stores, which then can change your pH of the vagina kind of to more of an acidic pH, which in menopause, it becomes basic, improves the normal healthy bacteria. We know that there's a lot of connection with how we feel and, the normal bacteria we host in our GI tract and well as the vagina. And so the CO2 laser can be applied internally and externally. And the Mona Lisa Touch, I think, has the most data that, and I have patients that come to me specifically just for that reason. So there are other options out there. Like I said, most of my patients do end up needing pelvic floor physical therapy because even if we're treating the pain at insertion, eventually they do end up having hypertonic floor because of all the experience that they've had.
Okay. Thank you for that. The next question is, how can we better equip ourselves prior to going in to discuss perimenopause? I've heard so many women say they've had pushback. This is a great question, particularly in light of this discussion, right? Mm-hmm. How do we, it's hours long of a conversation, yes. But for a woman of color, whatever that might be, coming in with all of her herself, her whole self, her experience, her history, the generations that have come before her, all of that. Mm-hmm. How do we walk in and sort of get our best appointment, get all that we need out of everything?
Yeah. And I think that is difficult because, depending on the clinician, and their experience, one of the reasons that, patients get pushback is the reality is we don't get enough training in perimenopause and menopause. Even as an OB-GYN, I can say most of my training had to be outside of residency. I saw a handful of patients. Of course, I graduated like 18 years ago, but I see a handful of patients that went through this. And the reality is, of course, even our literature has changed and our way of treating patients has changed. So again, that's why these organizations are kind of critical, because these are clinicians that are very interested in this topic and they want to do the best for their patient. But you will sometimes get that pushback because maybe the clinician isn't savvy. Like I've had patients, I told my doctor I was in early menopause like 6 or 7 times. I went to 5 or 6 clinicians. No one believed me. They said, you're too young. No one did an evaluation, which is always a shocker. At least like listen to the patient and figure out like, okay, maybe you in your mind, you don't believe that patient's in early menopause, but do the work and prove it wrong at least, But I think that is a challenge. And I would say that's probably the most frustrating thing. And a lot of it is because of lack of training and lack of sort of that extra, that knowledge base. So I would say equipping yourself, sometimes, even going to a reputable source, like the North American Menopause Society, there's a lot of great patient information there, and say like, look, I looked this up myself. This is what I have. I have all of these symptoms. Do you feel comfortable addressing them with me? And,
that's a great suggestion.
Hopefully your doctor or nurse practitioner, whoever is going to be up a forthcoming with you and say, yeah, no, of course, like I'm here to listen to you. But the reality is you might find someone that's like, that's not my thing. You need to find someone else. But hopefully that's what you get. Like, hopefully you get someone that's forthcoming, because I definitely have patients that come to me with stuff that I don't, like I used to do more cosmetics than I do now because my focus is so much on sex and menopause. But, I'd have patients come to me asking for lip filler, and I'd be like, I don't feel comfortable. Like, for me, at the end of the day, I have to be able to sleep at night. And if I can't sleep at night thinking that I, did something for a patient I shouldn't have. And so like, I would be very forthcoming and saying, no, go see a plastic surgeon, please. Yeah. I think that I hope that most clinicians are out there, because most of us do come to this profession with a desire to help. And a lot of people get jaded over time because of who they've worked for. And, the amount of sort of burnout is real. So I think that is, driving some of clinicians' inability to, get you there. But finding the right clinician is key, and unfortunately some patients are stuck with the fact that they have this insurance and this is the only person they can see. But
I was just going to say that I think there are these factors that may get in the way, like health insurance, or what you're sort of who you're sort of forced to go see. But if you can, I feel, I said this a few minutes ago, but I feel so strongly in hearing you speak for this last hour, that if you can spend the time, the energy, whatever it is, to get to a clinician who gives you that level of comfort, that level of regard, that level of understanding, it is everything. And I think, I've often said or heard physicians in these talks suggest things like, come in with your questions, come in armed, come in ready to go, because you really only have 10 or 15 minutes. And it's not that the doctor doesn't want to give you more time, but they really can't do that. So, but this is something more. And I think probably, I think, correct me if I'm wrong, but you're sort of encouraging us to do the work before we actually step in the office. And the work is just maybe finding the right person. And maybe it's calling the office and saying, right, asking some of these questions beforehand.
And I got to tell you, my midlife patients are on it. Like they're very, like,
good.
They'll call and say, can you ask this doctor if this condition that I have, will she treat it? Like for instance, I treat persistent genital rub. Can you ask her specifically if she will treat this, and I will come see her if she can. And so, I mean, I think and I think we as women have to recenter ourselves and say, this is a form of self-care. You know what? I'll go pay this amount of money for my haircut. And maybe that doctor is out of network for me. But guess what? A lot of doctors that will have, better self-pay rates. So, maybe I won't go get that haircut next week or, whatever, get my hair colored or whatever, think of it as self-care. You are trying to improve the quality of your life. And maybe that means I forego X to get Y right now. But, I can tell you that a lot of clinicians that maybe are out of network or even out of some insurances do have reasonable, either self-pay rates and sometimes they're even better than what because, with insurances, sometimes you have to meet like a $5,000 deductible to get anything covered. And so if that's the case, then sometimes you can pay like $200-300 and see somebody and not even worry about, I always say the only reason I have insurance is if I'm in a car accident or have to be hospitalized, because I think otherwise I would just try
just try and go it your own way.
Crap otherwise, but you have to have it because, no one can endure like these tens and thousands of dollars of hospital fees.
Dr. Rahman, in just our last few minutes, we had gotten this email from Laura mentioning this, menopause. I think it was maybe from an Oprah magazine. It was an Oprah something, but I couldn't access it. And it was about the danger of othering when talking about the diverse experiences of the menopause transition, and really sort of, I think, positing the white woman's experience in perimenopause and menopause as normal, and everyone else, every other person's experience is by default abnormal. So could you speak to that just for a few minutes? I know it's bigger than
I think that, that's a very important topic. And I feel that way sometimes. I'm a part of North American Menopause Society, but I'm also part of the International Menopause Society. So I see that I have patients because my parents are immigrated from Pakistan. So I have patients reach out to me from Pakistan. I don't have access to anyone that talks about this stuff, but can we talk about it? And it's the same kind of concept, like what I'm dealing with and all the data I have is from North America. And we don't even have data on all these other countries and what the stressors that you guys are experiencing. And it's this, but you have to kind of listen to the patient and try to figure out. And that's why I always like to ask patients what they do for a living, all of the stuff that might be, when the patient tells me that they have anxiety, I'm always what kind of treatment are you getting for it? Are you getting appropriate? So, it's really a full experience of understanding the person as a whole, and not just as, a white female or a brown female or a black female, because, on top of that, on top of the cultural, religious, and race issues that come up, there's real life experiences happening to this patient, right? Right now, someone's dealing with the death of a parent, someone's dealing with, job loss, someone's dealing with sexual harassment, whatever the case may be. And having that understanding can help you understand, well, maybe because that's prohibiting your sleep, which is making this worse, which is making this worse, which is making weight gain worse, the whole thing. And then all of a sudden you don't even feel like the same person anymore because you have all these things happening to you. So I think that's really important, that you're right, we can't other the experiences, because you have to really treat the whole patient, and that includes their race, that includes their culture, that includes their religion, and that includes what's happening to them at that point in time. And so that is a very important point. And unfortunately, we don't have a lot of data. Right now we're getting better at we don't have a lot. We used to not have a lot of data on women over 40, right? It was always on it was, if you were reproductive, that's what but now things are getting better, Gen X, Gen X is out there. We're doing this stuff. We're trying to make people listen to us. So I think that, the world is changing and things are on a better move in some places, right? We still have this whole abortion issue.
I know. Dr. Rahman, you are just a delight. The work you do is just so important. If you are not following Gyno Girl, please do. You will be awakened. If you are asleep, you will be upregulated, if you need to dial in a little more, you will certainly feel seen, heard, regarded, and respected. Thank you so much for this hour. Is there any other sort of how can anyone find you? Where are you in the world?
I'm on YouTube. I make YouTube. Oh, I'm actually in Chicago, downtown Chicago. That's
Mm-hmm.
where my practice is. But I am, like I said, working on multi-state license. I do have a license in California, and I do televisits. And so, you know, those are some of the things that I like to mention. But you know, this is a passion project for me. I always have felt, like I said, you know, my parents are wonderful, but they raised me in the way of their culture, of the culture that they understood. And of course, a lot of that meant, you know, stigmas around everything that I'm talking about. And so for me, it's something that I'm on a mission to destigmatize, because I really feel like, you know, until we do that, until we address things head on, we're not going to be able to, you know, really enjoy the quality of life. Yeah. And we're not going to be able to really enjoy our own quality of life. We're not going to be able to live our best life. Yeah. And we only have one life to live. So we got to try to live our best life. Right. So
thank you so much, Dr. Rahman. Just a pleasure. Someone wrote in, "You're amazing, doctor." And so we will end on that. I would love to have you back on again at some point. I just think there are pieces of this conversation that we can spend a lot more time on, and I feel just committed also to, you know, we do tend to sort of look at groups and pockets of women, and I do think that each of those demands their time, but also I just feel like there's a lot of us, there's a lot of women of color out there, and sort of, you know, the broad strokes is that we need our attention, and you know, we are not the other, right? Yeah. We are the
and we
also
have to demand it. Honestly, this is about our self-care, and this is about you know, improving our life, because so many people depend on us. We know that, so we can't take care of anyone else until we take care of ourselves.
Awesome. Thank you, Dr. Rahman. Thank you to everyone who came. I'm so pleased that you made it to this call. It makes my heart swell. So thank you. Thank you. Be well. Bye. Be well, everyone. Thank you.